Why No One Can Conquer Afghanistan. Full narration. History and Geography documentary. Hook. In 329 BC, Alexander the Great, a man who had shattered the Persian Empire, crossed the Hindu Kush mountains and stood at the edge of the known world, looked out over a land he had technically conquered. His armies controlled the cities, his generals occupied the fortresses, his banners flew from the walls of Bactra and Kandahar. And yet, within months, his soldiers were dying in the hills. Guerrilla fighters melted back into mountain passes that no Greek had ever mapped. Ambushes came from nowhere and vanished into everywhere. Alexander, who had never truly been defeated on an open battlefield, spent 3 agonizing years fighting an enemy he could not see, could not pin down, and could not destroy. He married a local princess, Roxana, partly out of love, partly out of political calculation. Even the conqueror of the known world understood he could not conquer Afghanistan. He could only try to belong to it. 33 centuries later, superpowers with satellite reconnaissance, precision-guided missiles, armored helicopters, and special forces carrying the most sophisticated weapons ever built repeated almost exactly the same story. The Soviet Union entered in 1979 with 115,000 troops and left 10 years later broken, humiliated, and financially exhausted, a defeat so profound it accelerated the collapse of the entire Soviet Empire. The United States and NATO entered in 2001 with the most powerful military coalition in human history and spent 20 years, nearly $2 trillion, and thousands of lives before withdrawing in 2021, leaving behind a country that looked, in many ways, exactly as it had before. How is this possible? How does the same land defeat every empire, every generation, every superpower across more than 2,000 years of recorded history? The answer is not about weapons. It is not about ideology. It is not even ultimately about the people, though the people matter enormously. The answer is written into the land itself. It is geography. Ancient, indifferent, unchanging geography that makes Afghanistan one of the most unconquerable pieces of terrain on Earth. This is the story of a land that has been at the center of human civilization for thousands of years, a crossroads between East and West, between the steppes of Central Asia and the plains of the Indian subcontinent, between the Mediterranean world and the Far East. Afghanistan sits at the intersection of every great trade route, every great migration, and every great imperial ambition the ancient and modern world has produced. And yet, despite being crossed and fought over and invaded by everyone from Alexander the Great to Genghis Khan to the British Empire to the Soviet Union to the United States of America, Afghanistan has never been fully, permanently conquered. Not once. We will examine why, through the mountains, the rivers, the climate, the tribal structures, the geography of supply lines, the history of resistance, and the fundamental paradox at the heart of this land. A paradox that every conqueror discovers too late. Afghanistan is easy to enter and impossible to hold. Block 1. The geography. What Afghanistan actually is. To understand why Afghanistan cannot be conquered, you must first understand what Afghanistan actually is, because most people who study it from the outside imagine it as a single, unified place. It is not. Afghanistan is a geographic accident. It is a territory defined not by natural boundaries or ethnic unity or shared history, but by the collision of empires. In the 19th century, the British Empire to the south and east, controlling India, and the Russian Empire to the north, advancing through Central Asia, needed a buffer state between them. Afghanistan was that buffer. Its borders were drawn by British and Russian diplomats in distant capitals to suit imperial convenience, not geographic logic. The Durand Line of 1893, which separated British India from Afghanistan, cut directly through Pashtun tribal lands, dividing families and clans who had lived together for centuries. That line became the border between Afghanistan and Pakistan. It has never been recognized by the Pashtun people on either side. What those diplomats created was not a nation-state. They created a container, and inside that container was some of the most varied, complex, and formidable terrain on Earth. The Hindu Kush mountain range runs like a spine through the center of the country, with peaks reaching over 7,000 meters. The Pamir Plateau in the northeast, the Wakhan Corridor, reaches altitudes where the air is too thin for most vehicles to function reliably. The western deserts, including the Registan and the Dasht-e-Margot, the Desert of Death, are among the harshest environments in Asia. Between these extremes are fertile river valleys, ancient cities, and some of the most strategically important mountain passes in human history. No single environment, no single language, no single ethnic group defines this territory, and that diversity is itself a form of defense. Afghanistan is home to Pashtuns, Tajiks, Hazaras, Uzbeks, Turkmen, Aimak, Baluch, Nuristanis, and dozens of smaller groups, each with their own language, customs, territory, and historical memory. Pashtuns make up roughly 42% of the population and dominate the south and east. Tajiks, speaking Dari, control much of the north and west. Hazaras, who may be descendants of Mongol soldiers, occupy the central highlands. Uzbeks and Turkmen live along the northern plains near the Amu Darya River. These groups have fought each other throughout history, and yet, when a foreign power attempts to impose its authority over all of them simultaneously, something remarkable happens. Not unity exactly, but parallel, simultaneous, overlapping resistance in different regions, using different tactics, drawing on different traditions of warfare, and the effect is the same as unity. The occupier cannot be everywhere at once. The resistance can. To grasp the full scale of the geographic challenge, consider the numbers. Afghanistan covers 652,000 square kilometers, roughly the size of Texas. Its border is 5,529 kilometers long. At any given moment during the Soviet occupation, Soviet forces garrisoned approximately 60 major positions across this territory. That works out to one garrison for every 10,000 square kilometers. In between those garrisons, mountains, desert, and people who had been governing themselves in those spaces for 1,000 years. Block 2. The Hindu Kush, the spine that breaks armies. The Hindu Kush is not just a mountain range, it is the central fact of Afghan geography. The name itself, Hindu Kush, is believed to derive from the Persian phrase meaning killer of Hindus, a reference to the thousands of slaves and soldiers who perished crossing these mountains in the ancient and medieval periods. The range stretches approximately 800 kilometers across Afghanistan, from the Pamirs in the northeast to the western edges near Herat. At its center, it reaches heights of 7,492 meters at Tirich Mir, the highest peak, and contains dozens of passes that are the only practical routes for armies, trade caravans, and supply lines moving through the country. The passes are the key. The Khyber Pass in the southeast, running from Pakistan into Afghanistan, is perhaps the most famous military corridor in Asian history. It is 53 kilometers long, at its narrowest point only 15 meters wide, with cliffs rising hundreds of meters on either side. Through the Khyber Pass came Alexander's successors, the Mughal emperors, the Sikh armies, the British expeditions, and, in the modern era, the supply convoys of the NATO alliance. The pass is a choke point of extraordinary power. An army moving through it is visible for kilometers, confined to a narrow path, unable to deploy its numbers, vulnerable to fire from above. Every conqueror who used the Khyber Pass knew they were passing through a throat that could be cut at any moment, and yet they had no alternative. The Salang Pass, at 3,878 meters elevation in the Hindu Kush, was the primary Soviet supply route from the north into Kabul. The Soviets built the Salang Tunnel in 1964, at the time one of the highest road tunnels in the world, to keep this route open year-round. In 1982, Mujahideen fighters set a fuel tanker on fire inside the tunnel. Hundreds of Soviet soldiers died, some from the explosion, others from carbon monoxide poisoning in the confined space. The tunnel, 2.7 kilometers long, became a death trap. The Soviets used it anyway because they had no choice. The mountains commanded the routes, and the routes commanded the country. In winter, the Hindu Kush is another kind of enemy. Snow closes the passes for months, supply lines are cut. Temperatures drop to minus 30 degrees Celsius at altitude. Armies that entered Afghanistan in summer have been stranded in winter, unable to receive supplies, unable to move, burning fuel faster than it arrives, losing soldiers to frostbite and exposure. The British Army of the Indus, retreating from Kabul in January 1842, was destroyed almost entirely, not in battle, but in the passes. Of approximately 16,500 British and Indian soldiers and civilians who began the retreat, one man, Dr. William Bryden, reached the British garrison at Jalalabad alive. One man. The mountains had done what no army could do directly. The physics of the Hindu Kush impose penalties on every modern military technology. Helicopter rotor blades generate lift by pushing against air molecules. At 3,000 meters altitude, air pressure is roughly 30% lower than at sea level. Soviet Mi-8 transport helicopters, rated to carry 24 fully equipped soldiers at low altitude, could barely lift 8 soldiers at operational altitudes in the Hindu Kush. This was not a design flaw, it was physics. The mountains impose a physics penalty on the technologically superior force, and they do not negotiate exceptions. Block 3. The rivers, lifelines that divide. Afghanistan's rivers are among its most important geographic features and one of its most effective defenses. 4 major river systems drain the country. The Kabul River, flowing east into the Indus, the Helmand River, the longest in Afghanistan at 1,150 kilometers, flowing southwest into the Hamoon wetlands on the Iranian border, the Hari River, flowing west toward Herat and into Iran, and the Amu Darya, ancient Oxus, forming the northern border with Tajikistan, Uzbekistan, and Turkmenistan. These rivers create the fertile valleys where most of the population lives. They also create natural boundaries that fragment the country into distinct zones, each one difficult to access from the others. The Amu Darya, the Oxus, was the barrier that defined the edge of the classical world. For Alexander the Great, crossing the Oxus was a profound symbolic act. Beyond it lay the unknown, the edge of maps, the territory that even Greek imagination had barely sketched. The river runs through a canyon in places, across steppe in others, and flows cold and fast with glacial meltwater. When the Soviets crossed it in December 1979, not on foot but in armored vehicles and helicopters, they crossed the same ancient boundary. And when they crossed back in February 1989, broken and defeated, the symbolism was not lost on anyone. The same river, the same crossing, the same direction of retreat. The Helmand River Valley became one of the most contested zones of the American and NATO campaign from 2001 to 2021. Helmand Province, which the Helmand waters through its center, is the heartland of Pashtun tribal culture and for decades has been the world's largest producer of opium.
The river irrigates the poppy fields that fund the Taliban and has done so through every attempt at eradication and substitution.
British troops in Helmand, particularly after 2006, when British forces were deployed there in force, found themselves fighting an enemy that could use the river crossings, the irrigation channels, the dense vegetation of the riverbanks, and the traditional mud-walled compounds of the villages as perfect fortification and perfect concealment. In a single year, British forces in Helmand fired more artillery shells than the entire British Army had fired in any year since the Korean War. The terrain absorbed it all. Afghanistan receives an average of 250 millimeters of rainfall per year, less than the Sahara in a good year, concentrated almost entirely in the winter months. In summer, most of the country is desperately, lethally dry. The rivers that flow from the Hindu Kush carry glacial meltwater that makes agriculture possible in the valleys. Seasonal changes transform the strategic landscape completely. Winter in the Hindu Kush is not merely inconvenient. Mountain passes at 3,000 meters close entirely under snow from November to April. Armies that enter in summer and plan to consolidate over winter find themselves cut off, isolated in their garrisons, unable to move, unable to reinforce, unable to retreat. The insurgents simply waited in their villages, gathering strength until spring opened the passes again. Block 4. The cities, islands in a sea of countryside. Every empire that has invaded Afghanistan has discovered the same painful truth about its cities. They are islands. Kabul, Kandahar, Herat, Mazar-i-Sharif, Jalalabad. These are ancient urban centers, some of them among the oldest continuously inhabited cities on Earth. Kandahar, Alexandroupolis to Alexander's generals, now the second largest city in Afghanistan, was founded as a Greek colony and has been a center of power for more than 2,500 years. Herat in the west was one of the great cities of the medieval Islamic world, a center of art, scholarship, and commerce rivaling Baghdad and Constantinople in its heyday. These cities can be taken. Every invader has taken them. The problem is that taking a city in Afghanistan has never meant controlling the country. Between the cities lies everything else: the mountains, the desert, the valleys, the passes, the thousands of villages, the agricultural communities, the nomadic pastoralists who move their herds across territories that cross every administrative boundary ever drawn. The countryside is where most Afghans have always lived, and the countryside has always resisted the authority of whoever controls the capital. This is sometimes described as the Kabul syndrome, a pattern in which a foreign power installs a government in Kabul. That government controls the major cities and the roads between them with varying degrees of effectiveness, and the countryside does exactly as it pleases. The Soviets experienced this acutely. Soviet forces held every major city. They held the airports, the highways, the military bases. And every day in the countryside, the Mujahideen attacked, mined roads, ambushed convoys, and governed their own areas with no reference whatsoever to the government in Kabul. The NATO coalition after 2001 repeated the pattern. Enormous resources were poured into Kabul: new buildings, new institutions, a new constitution, a new army, new police. Kabul became a modern city in many respects, with universities, restaurants, a growing middle class, internet connectivity, women in the workforce and in parliament. 40 kilometers outside the city, the Taliban collected taxes, administered justice under their own law, and recruited fighters. The government's writ ended at the city limits, and sometimes did not even extend that far. This is not a failure of policy or execution alone. It is a structural feature of Afghan geography, repeated across 2 millennia. The city and the countryside are different worlds, and controlling one does not mean controlling the other. The mountains create this discontinuity with mathematical precision. A paved road can connect 2 cities. It cannot connect to social realities. The city is administered, formal, visible to power. The valley behind the next ridge has its own Khan, its own Malik, its own system of dispute resolution that predates the state and will outlast it. In 2010, American soldiers conducting operations in Logar province, barely 80 kilometers from Kabul, were fighting in valleys where the population had never been effectively administered by any central government in living memory. The mountains do not merely prevent armies from moving. They prevent the formation of unified political loyalty across the territory they divide. Block 5. The Khyber Pass and the Logic of Supply Lines. Every army that has ever invaded Afghanistan has faced the same fundamental problem of logistics. An army in the field requires an extraordinary quantity of food, ammunition, fuel, medicine, spare parts, and reinforcements. These supplies must come from somewhere, and in Afghanistan, the routes by which they arrive are few, narrow, and extraordinarily easy to disrupt. The Khyber Pass is the most famous of these routes, but it is part of a larger truth. Afghanistan is a landlocked country surrounded by mountains, and every supply line into it passes through terrain that favors ambush. The British understood this clearly, or should have, after the First Anglo-Afghan War of 1839 to 1842. The Army of the Indus entered Afghanistan through the Khyber and other passes with 21,000 soldiers. It occupied Kabul. It installed a friendly ruler, and then it tried to maintain itself in the country on supply lines running hundreds of kilometers through passes controlled by tribes who had never agreed to let them pass. The costs were enormous. The political situation deteriorated, and the retreat of January 1842, that catastrophic annihilation in the passes, demonstrated what happens when supply lines through Afghan mountain terrain are cut. The British lost not just an army, they lost the knowledge that they could protect their own soldiers on those roads. The Soviets faced the same problem on a modern, mechanized scale. Their primary supply route ran from the Soviet Union across the Amu Darya through the Salang Tunnel and down to Kabul. The CIA, working through Pakistani intelligence, supplied the Mujahideen with weapons, money, and intelligence. Stinger missiles, American shoulder-fired anti-aircraft weapons, effective against Soviet helicopters and low-flying aircraft up to altitudes of 3,800 meters, destroyed the Soviet air superiority that had been their primary tactical advantage. Without air cover, Soviet convoys on the mountain roads became targets. A standard Soviet supply convoy in 1985 could statistically expect to be attacked. The Mujahideen did not need to destroy the convoys every time to win. They needed only to make the convoys expensive, dangerous, and demoralizing, which they did, systematically, for a decade. The Americans and NATO built the Northern Distribution Network after 2001, a supply route through Central Asia that bypassed Pakistan when relations deteriorated. At its peak, it was moving thousands of containers per month through Russia, Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, and Tajikistan, crossing 6 international borders before reaching Afghanistan. The complexity and cost of this network was staggering. Every kilometer of supply line through Afghanistan was a potential ambush site, a potential IED, a potential checkpoint controlled by a local warlord charging transit fees. The mountains do not merely fight armies, they tax them, slowly, continuously, until the cost of staying exceeds the value of what is being held. Block 6. Tribal Structure, the Invisible Government. One of the most persistent misunderstandings about Afghanistan is the assumption that it functions like a modern nation-state, that there is a government with authority, that laws are enforced uniformly, that loyalty flows upward through a hierarchy to a central power. Afghanistan has never worked this way. Its actual government, the structure that organizes daily life, mediates disputes, allocates resources, and commands loyalty, is the tribe. And the tribal system is not simply a primitive version of a modern state. It is a sophisticated, ancient, and remarkably resilient alternative to the state, one that has survived every attempt to replace or supersede it. The Pashtun tribal system is organized around the concept of Pashtunwali, the way of the Pashtun, a code of honor governing hospitality, revenge, protection of guests, and the defense of territory. Under Pashtunwali, a Pashtun man is obligated to offer hospitality to any guest who requests it, including, famously, enemies who seek shelter. He is obligated to pursue blood revenge for wrongs done to his family. He is obligated to defend the Nang, the honor of his family, his clan, and his tribe against any insult or encroachment. These obligations are not abstract cultural values. They are functional rules with serious enforcement mechanisms. A man who violates Pashtunwali is shamed before his community, loses standing, and may be excluded from the protection that community membership provides. For a foreign power trying to govern Afghanistan, Pashtunwali creates an almost impossible situation. When a military operation kills civilians, even accidentally, even in a strike that also kills enemy combatants, the survivors are not neutralized. They are activated. Pashtunwali demands revenge. Men who might have remained neutral become fighters. Men who were passive become recruiters. Every civilian death creates, with mathematical certainty, future enemies. This is not unique to Afghanistan. It is the logic of guerrilla warfare everywhere. But in Afghanistan, the tribal code gives it formal, binding, cultural force. The enemy regenerates itself automatically from every mistake. The Jirga, the tribal council, is the decision-making institution that governs Pashtun communities. Any significant decision, a marriage, a land dispute, a question of war or alliance, is decided by the Jirga, a gathering of male elders who deliberate by consensus. No single man has the authority to commit his tribe to a course of action without Jirga approval. This makes it extraordinarily difficult for a foreign power to negotiate with Afghan leaders. An agreement signed by one leader may have no binding effect on his community if the Jirga has not approved it. And the Jirga cannot be bought or intimidated into approval. It can only be persuaded, which requires patient, sustained engagement that occupying armies rarely have the time or cultural knowledge to pursue. When Al-Qaeda requested sanctuary from Afghan Pashtun communities in 2001, the refusal to hand Osama bin Laden over to the Americans, even under threat of invasion, was not political fanaticism. It was Pashtunwali. A Pashtun who surrendered a guest would be dishonored before his entire community. Geography had created a culture whose deepest values made foreign ultimatums structurally impossible to comply with without destroying the very social fabric that made life in those mountains viable. Block 7. Alexander the Great, the first to learn the lesson. Alexander the Great arrived in what is now Afghanistan in 329 BC, pursuing the last remnants of the Persian Empire under Bessus, the satrap of Bactria who had murdered the Persian king Darius III and declared himself king. Alexander had already conquered Egypt, the Levant, Persia, and Mesopotamia. He had crossed the Hindu Kush, not the first time, not the last, but the most dramatic in ancient memory, in winter, with an army weakened by altitude and cold, because he calculated that Bessus would not expect an attack in those conditions. He was right. Bessus fled. Alexander captured Bactria, the ancient region that corresponds roughly to northern Afghanistan, and established his capital at Bactra, modern Balkh, now a city in northern Afghanistan known as the Mother of Cities for its antiquity. But then, the Bactrian Sogdian revolt began. The local population, led by chieftains like Spitamenes, a commander of extraordinary guerrilla skill, refused to accept Macedonian rule. They did not fight pitched battles because they knew they could not win those. Instead, they conducted a 3-year campaign of ambush, raid, and retreat that cost Alexander more effort and more casualties than any of his great set-piece battles. Spitamenes attacked and then vanished into the steppe and the mountain passes, drawing Alexander's forces deeper into terrain that offered no decisive engagement. Alexander, a master of pitched battle, had no doctrine for this kind of war. Alexander's response was brutal. He founded military colonies throughout the region: Alexandria in Ariana, Alexandria in Arachosia, Alexandria in the Caucasus, garrisoning them with Macedonian veterans who were effectively prisoners in a foreign land, ordered to hold territory that hated them. He adopted local customs, wore Persian dress, married Roxana. He tried to make Bactria part of his empire rather than simply occupied territory. It was, in its way, the most sophisticated counterinsurgency strategy of the ancient world. And it failed. After Alexander died in 323 BC, his empire fragmented immediately. The Macedonian garrison colonies in Bactria lasted longer than most. The Greco-Bactrian kingdom survived until roughly 125 BC, but they survived by becoming, in effect, local rulers rather than Greek colonial administrators. They intermarried with local populations, absorbed local religion and culture, and governed as hybrid monarchs. Even success in Afghanistan required becoming Afghan. Block 8. The Mongols and Timur. Destruction as conquest. If Alexander struggled to hold Afghanistan through political accommodation, Genghis Khan tried the opposite approach: total destruction. When the Mongol armies swept through Central Asia in the early 13th century, they applied a systematic policy of annihilation to cities that resisted. Balkh, the ancient mother of cities, one of the great urban centers of the Islamic world, a city of perhaps 500,000 people, was razed to the ground in 1220. The population was massacred. The irrigation systems that had sustained agriculture in the region for millennia were destroyed. Herat was besieged and its population slaughtered. The medieval geographer Ibn Battuta, traveling through the region a century after the Mongol invasion, described Balkh as still in ruins, a ghost city inhabited only by wind and memory. The Mongols did not try to govern Afghanistan, they tried to empty it. And yet, even this failed to produce permanent Mongol control. The Mongol Khanate ruled Persia and parts of Afghanistan from Hulagu Khan's conquest in the 1250s, but the eastern reaches, the areas corresponding to modern Afghanistan, were always the most difficult to hold. The terrain that had resisted Alexander resisted the Mongols. The mountain regions never fully submitted. And within a generation, the Mongol rulers of the region began converting to Islam, intermarrying with local elites, and governing as Central Asian Muslim rulers rather than as Mongol conquerors. The pattern repeated. The conquerors became the conquered, culturally, if not militarily. Timur, Tamerlane, swept through Afghanistan a century and a half later, in the late 14th and early 15th centuries. He was not a foreign invader in the same sense. He was a Timurid from the same Central Asian cultural world, but his campaigns through Afghan territory demonstrated the same truth. He could devastate cities. He could massacre populations. He could build towers of skulls outside Herat to demonstrate the futility of resistance. But within a generation of Timur's death in 1405, Herat was again the capital of a powerful Timurid successor state, its libraries and mosques rebuilt, its scholars and artists producing some of the finest art and architecture of the Islamic world. The city survived, the land survived, the conquerors came and went, the mountains remained. Block 9. The British Empire. 3 wars, 3 lessons. The British Empire fought 3 major wars in Afghanistan in 1839 to 1842, 1878 to 1880, and 1919, and the arc of these 3 conflicts tells the story of an empire that was intelligent enough to eventually understand what it was dealing with, but never able to translate that understanding into actual control. The First Anglo-Afghan War is the most catastrophic military disaster in British imperial history. The Army of the Indus crossed into Afghanistan to replace the Amir Dost Muhammad Khan with the more pliant Shah Shuja-ul-Mulk. It occupied Kabul, installed the new ruler, and settled in. British officers brought their wives and families. They established a garrison, a cantonment, a horse racing track. They tried to build a stable occupation. The occupation lasted 2 years. The problem was money. The British cut the subsidies paid to the Ghilzai tribal chiefs who controlled the passes between Kabul and India. The Ghilzai revolted. A British officer, Alexander Burnes, was murdered by a mob in Kabul. Sir William Macnaghten, the chief political officer, was murdered by Akbar Khan, son of the deposed Dost Muhammad, during a negotiation in which he was attempting to buy off the very man who then killed him. The British commander, General Elphinstone, widely considered one of the worst generals in British military history, an elderly man in poor health who vacillated fatally in every crisis, agreed to a negotiated retreat. It was a trap. The 16,500 soldiers and civilians who left Kabul in January 1842 were picked apart by Ghilzai fighters every step of the way through the passes. Frostbitten, starving, ambushed, betrayed at every turn, they died in their thousands. One man reached safety. The mountains had done what no army could do directly. The Second Anglo-Afghan War of 1878 to 1880 was conducted with greater military competence. General Frederick Roberts fought a brilliant campaign, winning the decisive Battle of Kandahar in 1880. But the British concluded, from their second adventure, that they could not hold Afghanistan as a colony. The country was too expensive, too hostile, too vast. They settled for a different arrangement. The Treaty of Gandamak gave Britain control of Afghan foreign policy while leaving internal governance to the Afghan emirs. The British paid a subsidy. Afghanistan was nominally independent, but effectively a protectorate. This arrangement, control without occupation, was the most successful formula anyone ever found for managing Afghanistan from outside. And even it broke down in 1919 when the Third Anglo-Afghan War ended with full Afghan independence. The British, exhausted by the First World War, simply let go. The lesson the British extracted from 3 wars and 80 years of engagement was precise. You can influence Afghanistan's external relations, but you cannot govern its interior. The mountains will not permit it. The tribal structure will not permit it. The distances, the terrain, the cost, none of it pencils out for an occupier willing to be honest about the arithmetic. The British were, eventually, that honest. It is one of the few times in imperial history that an empire looked at a territory and concluded, based on evidence, that conquest was not worth the price. Block 10. The Great Game. Geography as Geopolitics. The 19th century saw Afghanistan become the central arena of what the British called the Great Game, the strategic competition between the British Empire in India and the expanding Russian Empire in Central Asia. Both empires feared the other's advance. Britain feared that Russia would eventually reach the warm water ports of the Persian Gulf or threaten British India. Russia feared British influence encircling it from the south. Afghanistan, lying between them, was the buffer, the space that neither power wanted to let the other control. The British geographer Halford Mackinder, writing in 1904, articulated the underlying logic: control the Eurasian heartland, the pivot area of Central Asia, and you control the world island of Eurasia. Control the world island, and you control the world. Afghanistan sat in the approach to the heartland. This geopolitical logic shaped Afghanistan in ways that persist to the present day. The borders drawn during the Great Game, particularly the Durand Line of 1893, created a state without natural coherence, divided peoples who had lived together, and attached strategic importance to a territory whose internal dynamics could not be managed from the outside. The Durand Line, negotiated between British India's Foreign Secretary Sir Mortimer Durand and Afghan Amir Abdur Rahman Khan, was intended to define the limits of each power's sphere of influence. It divided Pashtun territory arbitrarily. Pakistan, inheriting the British side of the line, has never been able to control the tribal territories along it. The federally administered tribal areas, now merged into Khyber Pakhtunkhwa, and Afghanistan has never accepted the line as a legitimate border. The geography defied the diplomacy, as it always does. The Great Game ended formally with the Anglo-Russian Convention of 1907, which divided Persia into spheres of influence and agreed that Afghanistan was a British protectorate. But the underlying dynamic, competing great powers using Afghanistan as a proxy arena, never ended. It resumed in the Cold War, when the United States and the Soviet Union competed for influence in Kabul. It emerged again after 2001, when Pakistan, Iran, India, China, Russia, and the Gulf states each backed different factions within Afghanistan. The geography that made Afghanistan a crossroads made it permanently contested. Every power that could project force toward it did so, and the Afghans navigated between these competing patrons, playing them against each other, taking money and weapons from whoever offered them, and maintaining their fundamental independence of action. The Great Game taught the world that Afghanistan was the prize. What it failed to teach was that Afghanistan cannot be won. Block 11. The Soviet Invasion, the Empire that Broke. On December 24, 1979, Soviet transport aircraft began landing at Kabul's Bagram Air Base. Within 72 hours, Soviet special forces had stormed the Tajbeg Palace in Kabul, killing Afghan President Hafizullah Amin, who had himself come to power through a coup, and installing Babrak Karmal as the new Afghan leader. Soviet mechanized divisions crossed the Amu Darya on pontoon bridges. The invasion, codenamed Operation Storm 333, was swift, technically competent, and strategically catastrophic. The Soviets believed they were intervening to stabilize a friendly communist government on their southern border. They did not anticipate a 10-year war. No one in Moscow, apparently, had studied the history carefully enough. The Soviet military in Afghanistan was, by any objective measure, formidable. At its peak, 115,000 Soviet troops were deployed in the country. They had tanks, armored personnel carriers, helicopter gunships, artillery, and fixed-wing aircraft. They had a central government in Kabul, the Afghan army, the Cod secret police. They controlled every major city, every major road, every airfield. What they did not control, what they could never control, was the countryside. The Mujahideen were fragmented into dozens of competing factions, organized by region and tribe, armed with whatever they could get, and motivated by a combination of religious conviction, nationalist resistance, and massive external support from the CIA, Pakistani intelligence, Saudi Arabia, China, and Egypt through Operation Cyclone, the largest covert operation in CIA history. The Soviets responded with tactics that, in retrospect, guaranteed their failure. Massive artillery bombardment of villages suspected of harboring fighters, aerial bombing of agricultural areas to deny food to the resistance,
The systematic destruction of qanats, the ancient underground irrigation channels that had sustained Afghan agriculture for millennia. Estimates of Afghan civilian deaths during the Soviet occupation range from 500,000 to 2 million. 5 million Afghans fled into exile in Pakistan and Iran.
These tactics guaranteed that the population of the countryside would fight the Soviets until the last Soviet left. The destruction created the fighters it was intended to prevent. The arrival of American-supplied Stinger missiles in 1986 fundamentally changed the military equation. Before the Stingers, Soviet Mi-24 Hind helicopter gunships dominated the battlefield, hunting Mujahideen columns in the open. After the Stingers, Soviet aircraft had to fly higher and faster, reducing their precision and effectiveness. Soviet convoys lost their air cover. The strategic initiative shifted. Soviet casualties mounted. Mikhail Gorbachev, who had come to power in 1985, called Afghanistan the bleeding wound and began the withdrawal that concluded in February 1989. The last Soviet soldier, Lieutenant General Boris Gromov, walked across the Friendship Bridge over the Amu Darya alone, turned to the cameras, and said there was no single soldier left behind him on Afghan soil. The Soviet Union itself collapsed 2 years and 9 months later. The connection between the Afghan defeat and the Soviet collapse is debated by historians, but few deny that the war accelerated the empire's terminal crisis. Block 12. The American Era. Technology meets geography. After the September 11th attacks of 2001, the United States went to war in Afghanistan with a military capability that dwarfed anything the Soviets had fielded. Precision-guided bombs, JDAMs, could be delivered from aircraft flying above the reach of anti-aircraft weapons with accuracy measured in meters. Predator and Reaper drones could surveil the Afghan countryside continuously, day and night, in any weather, and strike targets with missiles guided by live video feeds operated from control rooms in Nevada. Special forces operated in small teams with tactical communications, satellite imagery, and firepower on call within minutes. Night vision technology gave American and NATO soldiers complete tactical dominance after dark. No previous conqueror of Afghanistan had possessed anything remotely approaching this technological advantage. And yet, the outcome rhymed with every previous campaign. The Taliban government fell within weeks in late 2001, driven from every city, scattered into Pakistan, apparently destroyed. American forces established bases, trained an Afghan army and police force, built roads and schools, attempted to create a functioning government. Kabul grew, modernized, acquired a middle class. Girls went to school in numbers never seen before in Afghan history. For a brief period, some observers allowed themselves to believe that something genuinely different was happening, that technology and resources had finally broken the pattern that had defeated every previous conqueror. But the Taliban retreated to the Pakistani border areas, reorganized, recruited, and returned. By 2006, they were fighting a full-scale insurgency in the south and east. By 2008, American commanders were describing the situation as deteriorating. The geography reasserted itself. The mountains and valleys of Helmand, Kandahar, Kunar, and Nuristan became the same ungovernable spaces they had always been. American and NATO forces controlled the valleys by day, and the Taliban controlled them by night. The Taliban's commanders had fought in these areas for decades. They knew every path, every family, every tribal grievance. The rotating foreign forces were perpetually new, perpetually learning, perpetually starting over with each 12-month rotation. When the American money and air support were removed, abruptly in 2021, the Afghan security forces, which existed as institutions largely because of that external support, collapsed within days. The Taliban walked back into Kabul on August 15, 2021, 20 years after they had been driven out. The total American expenditure was approximately $2.26 trillion. The total duration of the conflict was 7,268 days, longer than the American Civil War, World War I, World War II, and the Korean War combined. The mountains had watched it all before. Block 13. The Economic Dimension. Poverty as Armor. There is one dimension of Afghanistan's unconquerability that receives less attention than the geography and the military history, but which is equally fundamental. It's poverty. Afghanistan is one of the poorest countries on Earth. In 2020, before the final American withdrawal, its GDP per capita was approximately $500 per year, a figure that placed it among the lowest in the world. Its formal economy was, for 20 years, heavily dependent on foreign aid. At its peak, international aid accounted for roughly 40% of GDP and 75% of public expenditure. Remove the aid, which is what happened after 2021, and the formal economy largely ceases to function. But the formal economy was never where most Afghans lived. The informal economy, subsistence farming, livestock herding, trade through traditional networks, and the opium economy sustained the majority of the population throughout the war years, through the Soviet occupation, through the Civil War of the 1990s, through the American presence, and beyond it. Opium cultivation, which reached a peak of approximately 224,000 hectares in 2014, provides the raw material for roughly 80 to 90% of the world's heroin. The opium economy generates billions of dollars per year in revenue that flows to farmers, traffickers, warlords, and the Taliban, bypassing every formal institution. Every attempt to eradicate poppy cultivation has failed, partly because it is impossible to police 224,000 hectares of mountain farms, partly because the alternative livelihoods offered to farmers have never come close to matching opium's income. This informal, decentralized economy is another form of resilience. A modern state requires infrastructure, banks, supply chains, communication networks, transportation systems that can be targeted, disrupted, destroyed. An economy based on subsistence farming, livestock, and smuggling networks that have operated for centuries requires none of these things. It functions at the village level, in the valleys and on the mountain slopes, with or without a functioning central government. You cannot strangle an economy that has no arteries to cut, and you cannot win the loyalty of a population by offering economic development if that development requires the kind of stability that the conflict itself makes impossible to achieve. Afghanistan's poverty is not simply a problem to be solved. It is, in the specific context of resistance to conquest, a form of protection. Block 14. The strategic location cursed by geography. Afghanistan's geographic position at the intersection of South Asia, Central Asia, the Middle East, and East Asia is the source of its curse as well as its historical importance. It sits astride the ancient Silk Road, the network of trade routes that connected China to the Mediterranean for more than 1,000 years. The Silk Road ran through Afghanistan not by accident, but because the mountain passes of the Hindu Kush were the most practical routes connecting the great civilizations of the ancient world. Lapis lazuli from the mines of Badakhshan, the intense blue stone that appears in the tombs of Egyptian pharaohs and the paintings of Renaissance Europe, was traded through Afghanistan from at least 3000 BC. The routes that carried lapis lazuli also carried silk, spices, horses, ideas, religions, and armies. This position makes Afghanistan permanently, structurally significant to every great power in its vicinity. China, whose Belt and Road Initiative aims to rebuild modern versions of the Silk Road, has courted the Taliban government since 2021, offering investment in exchange for security guarantees and access to Afghanistan's mineral resources. Afghanistan sits atop an estimated $1 to $3 trillion in untapped mineral deposits, copper, iron, lithium, gold, rare earth elements that could theoretically fund the country's development for generations. The Mes Aynak copper deposit in Logar province is one of the largest undeveloped copper deposits in the world. Chinese state companies won the mining rights in 2007, but have been unable to develop the deposit because of security concerns. The lithium deposits in Ghazni, Herat, and Helmand have been described by American geologists as potentially making Afghanistan the Saudi Arabia of lithium. None of this wealth has been developed because the security situation makes sustained industrial development impossible. The strategic location also means that Afghanistan's neighbors are always involved in its internal affairs. Pakistan supports the Taliban because it sees a friendly Pashtun-dominated government in Kabul as strategic depth against India. Iran supports Afghan Shia groups, particularly the Hazara, and has cultivated political relationships with both the Taliban and its opponents, depending on circumstances. India builds infrastructure and trains Afghan technocrats because it sees Afghanistan as a way to project influence into Central Asia and to outflank Pakistan. Russia has quietly opened lines of communication with the Taliban because it fears jihadist influence spreading into Central Asia. Afghanistan cannot simply be left alone because its location makes it impossible for its neighbors to leave it alone. It is the center of gravity of a continent, and that centrality is another form of its curse. Blockchain 15, The Eternal Pattern, What History Teaches. Standing back from 2,000 years of Afghan history, a pattern emerges that is so consistent, so precisely rhyming across different eras, different technologies, different ideologies, and different levels of military power that it cannot be attributed to accident or contingency. The pattern is structural, it is geographic, it is cultural, and it suggests that the question, why can no one conquer Afghanistan, has a clear, if complex, answer. The geography, the mountains, the passes, the deserts, the river valleys, the altitude, fragments the territory into zones that cannot be controlled simultaneously from any single center of power. Each zone requires its own garrison, its own supply line, its own political management. The resources required to maintain control across all these zones simultaneously exceed what any imperial power has ever been willing to commit permanently. Empires can surge, pour in troops, money, and will for a decade or two, but they cannot sustain that surge indefinitely. And the moment they reduce their commitment, the underlying dynamics reassert themselves. The tribes return to their own governance. The mountain communities return to their own law. The formal institutions created by the occupier, which were never deeply rooted, wither. The tribal structure, Pashtunwali, the Jirga, the code of revenge and hospitality, provides a parallel governance system that continues to function regardless of what happens to the formal state. When the state is destroyed, the tribe remains. When the formal government collapses, the Jirga continues to meet. When the police and army dissolve, the tribal militias remain armed. This parallel governance is not a sign of underdevelopment. It is a sophisticated adaptation to a specific environment, one in which centralized governance has always been unstable and external threats have always been recurrent. The tribe is the resilient unit, the state is the fragile superstructure. The historical memory of resistance, the knowledge passed from generation to generation that foreign powers can be outlasted, is itself a weapon. Every Afghan child grows up knowing that Alexander came and left, that the Mongols came and left, that the British came and left, that the Soviets came and left, that the Americans came and left. This is not abstract history, it is living tradition, reinforced by the physical environment, the passes, the ruins, the ancient fortresses, and by the oral culture that preserves it. An occupying power fighting an insurgency is fighting against time as well as against fighters. The insurgent knows this. The occupier eventually learns it. And the asymmetry, the occupier's finite commitment versus the defender's infinite patience, resolves itself in the same direction every time. Closing. In the end, Afghanistan teaches a lesson that geography has always been trying to teach empires, and that empires have always been reluctant to learn. Power does not flow from weapons or wealth or technology alone. It flows from legitimacy, from the consent, however qualified, of the governed, and from sustainability, the ability to maintain commitment across time. No empire that has entered Afghanistan has possessed both of these things simultaneously. They have had power, but not legitimacy, or moments of legitimacy that their power eroded, or technological superiority that the terrain neutralized, or political will that time exhausted. The mountains of the Hindu Kush have not changed. The Khyber Pass is exactly where it has always been. The Helmand River still flows southwest to the desert. The Pashtun tribes still gather in Jirga. The ancient trade routes still cross this land at the center of Asia. Geography does not negotiate. It does not accommodate. It does not care about the ideology of the conqueror or the sophistication of his weapons. It simply presents the same conditions, generation after generation, to anyone bold enough or foolish enough to test it. Afghanistan has been called the graveyard of empires. That phrase is sometimes dismissed as cliché, and it is true that it oversimplifies a complex history, that some empires have managed Afghanistan more successfully than others, that the country itself has been devastated as much as the invaders. But the essential truth the phrase captures is real. This land, at the center of the world, has a way of destroying the certainties of those who enter it with confidence. Alexander knew it. The British learned it at catastrophic cost. The Soviets learned it and did not survive the learning. The Americans learned it over 20 years and $2 trillion. The mountains were there before any of them. They will be there long after. History does not repeat itself in Afghanistan, but it rhymes with an extraordinary precision that should give every future conqueror pause. Approximate word count, 5,800 words.